Wanderstones reproduce in a strange way. A new wanderstone is brought into the world during auspicious occasions when a herd is gathered. Members of a herd chant in their rolling, gravelly baritones, rhythmically drumming on the ground, their bodies, and stamping their feet, while a few find rocks within the area that have the right resonances, sculpting and refining them. Finally, a rune is carved on the forehead depicting some significant event occurring during the birth of this being. This could be an eclipse, a volcanic eruption, or the sprouting of a blade of grass, summoning an earth spirit that becomes a wanderstone. Greetings and welcome to the Dream Syndicate. In today's video, I'll show you the process of how I made these resin sculptures from a two-part silicone mold. The process of designing these rock critters wasn't without challenges. In fact, I had setback after setback after setback, and that's probably understating things. This is actually a creature idea I've had for months living in my sketchbook, and when I came back to it, I thought it would be really well developed, like I had the sketch all ready to go. It was more like that D&D meme where you took notes during the D&D session, and it says, "Sexy Goblin?" So I sculpted this adult version, but the only problem was if I were to do this image that has a whole herd of them, I'd be sculpting like 10 or 12 of these, which I'm going to do eventually, but I'm going to let that wait for a little bit. So instead, I thought I'd do like a sort of a little resin sculpture or a planter out of this. So I started messing around with that. What I was thinking for these creatures is as they would travel and age and see things, they would carve various runes and glyphs into their bodies. They'd be abstracted geometric shapes of natural phenomenon, and here's a sheet of some examples I did when I was messing around with some ideas. I was still messing around with that idea of making a planter, but I decided to just make it a resin cast sculpture. Then I started to push the design in the direction of a cutesy version of it, so you can imagine it almost like a toddler version of the Wanderstone. We'll build a mold box with good old Legos and plastilina clay. I'll put a link in the description and pinned comment where you can find the materials I'm using. We'll alternate between building up the outer Lego walls and adding more clay. And where the clay ends, we'll form half of the silicone mold. This is a great use of secondhand Legos, though it's on the larger end of anything I'd try to cast this way. If I were trying to mold something bigger than this, I've seen some pretty cool tutorials where a mold box is made from wood and it's reusable. I'm pretty new at mold making, but there's some channels with some great resources if you want to dive deep into this stuff. There's Robert Tolone, who has more mold making experience than I've been alive, and there's also Steve Ferrera, who has a bunch of great tutorials as far as casting and even painting resin sculptures. I'll put links to their channels below so you can check them out. The way we leave the parting line is going to inform the seam that's going to end up on the resin casts. What we can do to clean this up a bit is liquefy the plastilina with a heat gun. I think that I have this on like 500, 600 degrees or something like that. It would definitely be an ouchie if you touched the metal tip. I'm being careful to keep the heat gun aimed at the clay and not end up with a molten pile of Legos. You can tell it's hot because you can see the clay sweating here. I'll wait for it to cool a bit, then use my fingertips and some water to smooth it out. Now we'll use a couple of ball styluses to create a sort of interlocking key that the mold will allegedly lock into. If you're using techniques you learned from any of my videos, I'd be happy to take a look. You can tag me wherever you're posting to. You can find my links below in the description and pinned comment. And here's what it looks like when we're pretty much ready to mold. We're just going to build up that last bit of height, and I'm making it taller on the bottom for a certain reason that you'll see in just a little bit. Here's a couple of detailed shots of the prototype sculpture. The eyes sit in the sockets a bit deeper, but I just have them held in place with that poster tack stuff. The sculpture is sort of a box shape along the back with a pyramid form extending from the front. So to be more efficient with the silicone, I rigged up this sort of angled contraption. I just have a piece of scrap wood held in place by vices, and that's going to keep everything from sliding off the table. And then around the back here, there's a couple of pieces of wood stacked up on top of one another. Here I'm using a smaller size of 𝐼𝐴 15 Slow because the larger, like gallon bucket of it is super expensive. There is no way cheaping out on a crucial material to the process could go wrong. I end up using all the mold star, mixing equal parts of A and B. This seems like too big of a job for our humble popsicle stick, but we'll still try to get this thoroughly mixed up. Since I can only get in there so much with the popsicle stick, I'm actually going to pour it into another container and stir it in there, and hopefully that gets it thoroughly mixed up. As a bit of a PSA, when you're working with resins and silicones, it's liquid rubber and liquid plastics that you're working with, so not good fumes to breathe in, so you want to have plenty of ventilation and even fans to vent fumes away from you. Later on in my setup, I'll have a fan on either side of my station, which is blowing out any of the vapors that are coming off of it. This is making me anxious. I am rapidly running out of silicone, and there's a lot of uncovered sculpture. Even after trying to add silicone scraps to bulk out the mold, this did in fact go wrong. So we'll have to get the sculpt out of the silicone. On the plus side, I'll be able to save the scraps to bulk out future molds. I pried and cut the sculpture out of the silicone, and this also means I'll have to do the whole process over again with the mold bed and build the box around it, all that fun stuff. Alright, let's regroup and try this again. This time I added an interior clay berm that'll help us use less of the silicone. And this time we're not screwing around. It's time for the buckets of mold star, because it's even better when you have to order even more after screwing up the first time. You need to stir up both parts A and B before you use it. I'm usually able to use popsicle sticks to stir the silicone, but look at this, I have to use a freaking paint stirrer. I decided that 24 ounces of each part should be enough. Here goes. We'll pour and see what happens. And yes, it was enough. Here we can see the silicone all set after a few hours. Since the mold box is on a slant, all the silicone that's going to leak out should come out the bottom. So I put a piece of cardboard there, and it did a really great job of catching anything that would come out. This stuff is pretty enjoyable to peel off, to be honest. And you get a really fun, floppy skin of silicone at the end. It kind of looks like a cute little ghost. Boo! I got creative with the clay again, plugging holes and building out the walls a bit. We want to leave the sculpture embedded in the first half of the mold so everything will register correctly. Then I had to rebuild the Lego box around it. And we'll begin pouring our second half of the mold. Hopefully we have enough silicone and we're good to go. Not today, Satan. I used mold release, but I guess I have to use way more next time. Getting the original sculpture out of the mold caused the fingers and the toes to break off, and a decapitation. The keys I pressed into the first half of the mold didn't really work, and the two halves of the mold sort of fused together, so I had to wrestle the original sculpture out of there. And this is actually the second time for the finger and toe breakage. The first failed mold had me resculpting the finger and toes last time. In spite of everything, I ended up with a pretty clean mold. though eventually silicone molds wear out. When that happens, my options are to let that be the end of this resin sculpture. I can try to repair my original sculpture and do another mold of it. I can just try to recreate it based off my original sculpture, or I can recast from a really good casting I get from this mold. You might notice there isn't a spout to pour into. That's because I'm experimenting with a method of slush casting. We'll completely fill the front, larger side with resin, and maybe add the tiniest bit to the back of the mold. If poured solid, these would use a ton of resin, so with this method, they'll be hollow. We'll take like 5, 6 rubber bands across the mold. Casting each one takes around 40 minutes of slowly turning the mold in my hands every which way. And for my purposes, I want most of the material to settle into the base of the casting, so I kind of finagle it that way while I'm working with it. And that's one method of slush casting. Since a little resin's likely to leak out when casting this way, I add thin pieces of cardboard below the rubber bands to the sides and bottom, as well as wear gloves when I'm doing this. Here's our first casting, and it was a bit of a disaster, though you might not see it. It took forever to set and was kind of leaking out of the mold for some reason. I tried to put thin black acrylic paint in it to pigment it, and that didn't work. And it's also thin in areas, so it made me nervous about the next casting, but mercifully, that went way better. Like I said, from there the castings got a lot better, though a few were thin-walled in the base and the back. You can kind of see my hand while I'm shining a light through it. I'm pretty sure I can fix these by putting it back into the mold and just pouring more resin and slush casting it again. I used a silver gray mica powder, and it's interesting that the matte surface of the clay transferred to the mold, so it dulled the shininess of the powder. On this piece here, it's way shinier. Since the key on the mold is kind of non-existent, there's some variations to the castings, and sometimes the parting lines are too exaggerated. A graphic designer friend once told me something that one of his teachers told him. You can either try to fix it or celebrate it. This isn't a thing I can change, so I instead decide to celebrate the uniqueness of each casting. So this way, it's more like each Wanderstone will be an original piece of art. This approach wouldn't work for every creature design, but since these creatures are meant to be fairly asymmetrical, it makes sense. In some places, we'll sculpt back into the casting with epoxy sculpt. Wanderstones are drawn to the same resonances that cause other beings to live places, which when enough of them gather can be quite perilous. A small group of Wanderstones is called a ruckus, and outside of the occasional nuisance of a few of them rolling or a sudden crash, isn't anything to be concerned about. As these boulderous creatures gather, they tend to form themselves into piles when stationary, readjusting from time to time. Now when Wanderstones congregate in greater numbers, 20 to 50 or more, they're referred to as a calamity, which has the potential to cause injury or death, or could even cause a rockslide that flattens buildings or even entire villages. Some individuals take up the profession of a rock herd or stone shepherd to drive a ruckus or calamity to more remote areas with the aid of a tuning fork that they strike in certain pitches and rhythms that lures the beasts away. To get the bases of the resin sculptures nice and flat, I've wood glued various grits of sandpaper to some boards. They're a flat plane, so it should help me grind the sculpture bottom to that shape. We'll also grind away larger areas we don't like with a Dremel tool. Then file off seam lines and refine any other areas. I primed the resin cast sculptures with spray paint, and after that dried, we'll add a layer of mid-tone gray. I started laying down some paint tones, but I felt like it was quickly getting out of hand. So I threw down a couple layers of textured Mod Podge and did some quick experiments on Bristol board. Having some directions to head in, we'll apply it to our painting. I'm planning on doing an ink wash to bring out the surface details, so here we'll quickly apply a matte varnish and let it dry overnight. We'll also hit the sculptures with a couple of coats of varnish when they're all done to help protect the paint. We'll apply the ink wash, which is ink thinned with water, and I added a tiny drop of dish soap all over the sculpture. We'll leave it sit for a minute or two, and then dab it off. And I'm feeling like the ink wash has flattened out the colors too much, so I'm going to dry brush some of the lighter tones that we lost. Dry brushing is a technique where your brush doesn't have much paint on it. It's barely on the bristles. You brush across the surface of what you're painting. The raised areas pick up your paint, and it mostly misses the lower and recessed areas. Painting these would have taken about half as long if I would have started with a darker tone and then done a few layers of my darker washes first. From there, the way to much more quickly paint these guys would have been to dry brush them instead of going back and forth so much in the process. Learning how not to paint something is still a lesson. It took a lot of effort to get there, but I'm thrilled with the end result. There's so many subtle color shifts happening as light hits them from different directions. These Wanderstones will be available from my store, and I'll put a link where you can get them. Now we'll just glue in the eyes. For this I'm using some Crafter's Pick, which is a strong but non-toxic glue. We'll firmly press them in, and once they're all set, I'll remove any smudges with a bit of rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip. Click the top video if you want to see me mold another fantasy creature, a Drean, and the second video to see another art dial build. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to join me in making the imaginary reality, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Until next time, make believe.